It's a pleasure to be here with you. It's wonderful to be with friends of St. Paul VI and friends of Blessed Jerome Le Jeune, friends of life. I'll never get to meet all of you, but we're all friends together in this great cause. And thank you so much for inviting me, Monica. It's a great pleasure to be here. With the use of contraceptives by married couples has been considered morally illicit by the Church from its very beginning. Indeed, it can quite convincingly be argued that the immorality of contraception has been infallibly taught by the Church. However, today I want to argue that contraception is fundamentally simply unreasonable. It doesn't make sense. And it also is inevitably bound up with abortion. Last year there was a book published here in Rome by a Vatican publishing house, a rather unfortunate book, that suggested that contraception might on occasion be morally illicit. And I quote the editor of that book: "The wise choice with regard to contraception will be realized by appropriately evaluating all possible techniques with reference to their specific situation for the couple, and obviously excluding abortifacient ones." The problem is that contraception inevitably leads to abortion. Not that individuals who contracept would necessarily go on to abort, but in terms of developing a cultural mindset, they're inextricably bound up together. Although abortion is far more grave than contraception, both manifest an anti-life mentality, and both posit concrete acts which are directed against life. As St. John Paul II pointed out in his encyclical Evangelium Vitae, quote, "Despite their differences of nature and moral gravity, contraception and abortion are closely connected as fruits of the same tree," end quote. We can, in my opinion, understand why they are linked as fruits of the same tree with a simple understanding of human nature and of the nature of human acts. Let us see first why contraception is simply unreasonable. I'm going to get a little philosophical here. I mean, after all, I am a professor. And after all, philosophy is common sense, somewhat refined. We know that individuals act for ends, goals, which they see as good. In fact, we understand a human being to be acting reasonably when he or she acts for an end perceived as a good. As St. Thomas Aquinas teaches us, quote, "The end is the principle in human operations. Therefore, it belongs to the human person to do everything for an end." And also, every agent acts for an end. Indeed, the end of an act is what defines what the act is. Beyond that, the end is also what makes any act even possible, since one only acts for an end. A couple days ago, I walked through the front door of my house, and somebody could say, "What did Haas just do?" And the answer would be, "What's he doing?" And the answer could be, "Well, he just walked through the front door of his house." But that doesn't answer the question. I walked through the front door of my house to change a flat tire on my car. I walked through the front door of my house to catch a plane to go to Rome to participate in a Congress on Humanae Vitae. It's the end that defines what we're doing. Now, there was admittedly a period when moral theology was dominated by a legalistic approach, which did appear to pit abstract moral norms against individual conscience. However, the more sound approach to moral theology, one that was championed by a great Dominican theologian, Serves Pinckaers, the more sound approach to moral theology is one that places the emphasis not on laws and norms, but rather on the reasonableness of human behavior in pursuit of happiness. As St. Augustine said, "Everyone wants to be happy. There is no one who will not agree with me on this almost before the words are out of my mouth," end quote. And happiness is realized in human flourishing as the moral agent acts in accord with the inherent ends of human nature. In fact, one can see in the Catechism of the Catholic Church that moral theology is primarily concerned with reasonable behavior that conforms to human nature. The Catechism of the Catholic Church states, sin is an offense against, and people answer it, sin is an offense against God's laws. Sin is an offense against God's will. It is that. But the Catechism of the Catholic Church says, sin is an offense against reason, truth, and right conscience. It is a failure in genuine love for God and neighbor caused by perverse attachment to certain goods. The Church considers sin to be constituted by unreasonable behavior, which seeks goods in a way that does not conform to our human nature. Reasonable human behavior is constituted by the moral agent acting on behalf of ends perceived as goods, and ends, as St. Thomas points out, constitute the principle of human action. Ends define and make possible human acts. Again, St. Thomas, although the end be the last in the order of execution, yet it is first in the order of the agent's intention. The 1917 Code of Canon Law defined marriage in terms of ends. The primary end of marriage is the procreation and education of children. The secondary end is mutual support and a remedy for concupiscence, end quote. Marriage is defined in terms of its own inherent ends toward which it is naturally ordered, and which thereby tell us what it is, what marriage is. As the Jesuit Bernard Lonergan has said, marriage is more an incorporation of the end of sex than of sex itself. For what is first or primary in the ontological constitution of a thing is not the experiential datum, but on the contrary, what is known in the last and most general act of understanding with regard to it. St. Thomas and Bernard Lonergan are not the only ones with this insight. I quote another author. It is a characteristic common to all the sexual perversions that in them reproduction as an aim, an end, is put aside. This actually is the criterion by which we judge whether a sexual activity is perverse, if it departs from reproduction in its aims and pursues the attainment of gratification independently. That wasn't St. Thomas, that was Sigmund Freud. Even those who are not Catholic understand human nature and understand how it works. Human beings are naturally drawn toward ends which they see and perceive as good. Indeed, love can be defined as the spontaneous movement of the will toward that which is good. St. Thomas says, love regards good in general. Men and women are drawn to marriage out of a love for the goods which it incorporates. First, the good of children, since that in the final analysis explains marriage and the marital act. But men and women also, in a more immediate sense, are drawn to the good of mutual support or friendship, which the couple finds in marriage. So it is the ends of marriage which explain what that institution is, and indeed, they make it possible. This truth was taught by St. Paul VI in Humanae Vitae. The Holy Father admittedly moved away from the use of philosophical terminology in discussing marriage, such as ends, but retained the meaning found in the language of ends. He speaks of, quote, the inseparable union established by God, which man on his own initiative may not break, between the unitive significance and the procreative significance, which are both inherent in the marital act, end quote. The human person cannot break the bond between the unitive and procreative ends of marriage, since they constitute the very definition of what marriage is. And man and woman are naturally drawn to those ends perceived as good. God has endowed every human being with a faculty St. Thomas calls synderesis, the inborn knowledge of the primary principles of moral action. And the most concise articulation of the first principle of moral action is do good, avoid evil. Because human behavior is seen to be reasonable when one acts on behalf of ends seen and understands as goods, it is likewise unreasonable to act against a good as though it were an evil. This would indeed violate the first principle of practical reason. It would violate the first principle of morality. Now, human beings are not obliged to realize all the goods of which they are capable. It would be impossible. However, they do have an obligation never to act against a good as though it were an evil, because that would be unreasonable. It would violate our very nature. To act against a good as though it were an evil would violate synderesis, the first principle of human action: do good, avoid evil. And it is here, I believe, that one encounters the immorality, the unreasonableness, the disorder of contraception. Contraception always involves an act other than the marital act. Think about it. Contraception always involves an act other than the marital act, and that other act is directed specifically against the procreative good which is inherent within the marital act. The name of the act itself describes its malice. It is contra. It is against the procreative good. Contraception is a chosen and willed act against a good inherent in the marital act in which a couple has chosen to engage. Every act of contraception is an act other than the marital act: taking a pill, putting on a condom, inserting a diaphragm, surgically cutting the fallopian tubes. Are all these the kinds of techniques which ought to be weighed, as that author I quoted earlier said, would lead us to make a wise choice about contraception? But each of these actions is different from, other than, the marital act, and each has no other purpose than to be directed against the realization of the ends or goods that make sense of, indeed make possible, the marital act. To engage in an act of contraception is to act in violation of our reasonable nature, which is to act on behalf of ends perceived as goods. St. Paul VI anticipated that the reasonableness of the teaching of his encyclical Humanae Vitae would be readily understood and accepted. He wrote, "If each of these essential qualities, the unitive and the procreative, is preserved, the use of marriage fully retains its sense of true mutual love and its ordination to the supreme responsibility of parenthood to which man is called." We believe that our contemporaries are particularly capable of seeing that this teaching is in harmony with human reason. The teaching of Humanae Vitae is in harmony with human reason. Unfortunately, the effects of literally untold sums of government and foundation money and the relentless actions of national governments and international agencies such as the United Nations, spending billions with a B, and the propaganda of our so-called elite educational institutions have had the effect of clouding reason and distorting the application of synderesis, so that evil is now seen as good and good is seen as evil. St. Paul VI acknowledged that not every chosen marital act would or should result in engendering new life. Marital intercourse during the infertile period in the wife's cycle is an obvious example, but he taught that a couple could quite legitimately choose to engage in the marital act during those periods if there was a moral obligation to avoid a child at a given moment in their lives. But simply abstaining does not require acting against the procreative good. He went on, "The Church teaches that each and every marital act must of necessity retain its intrinsic relationship to the procreation of human life." The significance of these words is clear. When a married couple engages in marital relations during the infertile period, even knowing conception most likely will not occur, they are acknowledging by their act that it nonetheless retains its intrinsic relationship to the procreation of human life. Indeed, that's why they are limiting the marital act to the period of infertility in the wife's cycle. They do not act against the procreative good. They simply realize other goods of marriage without acting against any good. An act of contraception is an act, apart from the marital act, deliberately chosen to be against the procreative good. This is what St. Paul VI meant when he wrote that the married couple, quote, must also recognize that an act which impairs the capacity to transmit life, which God the Creator through specific laws has built into it, frustrates his design, which constitutes the norm of marriage and contradicts the will of the author of life. We see this in the judgment of the 1930 encyclical Casti Connubii of Pius XI, when he condemned the statement of Anglican bishops that perhaps contraception could be used in certain circumstances. Pius XI wrote, "Any use whatsoever of matrimony exercised in a way that the act is deliberately frustrated, that is, by engaging the human will in its natural power to generate life, is an offense against the law of God and of nature, and those who indulge in such are branded with the guilt of a grave sin," end quote. In other words, the sin lies in engaging the will to act against the procreative good inherent in the act which the married couple has freely chosen to engage in. When I was a young man in Pennsylvania, the sale and distribution of contraceptives was against the law. I know I'm an old man. You can all see that, right? But that's not that long ago. In fact, you could still go out and buy packages of condoms, but on the packaging it said, condoms, prophylactics, sold for the prevention of disease only, because in Pennsylvania you couldn't buy a condom to prevent a baby. You could only buy it to prevent the spread of a disease. That was in Pennsylvania in 1966, if you will. The reason condoms could be sold for the prevention of disease was because it was against the law for them to be sold for the prevention of babies. And prophylactics are, of course, devices or medications that work against the spread of disease or infection, such as sexually transmitted diseases. Prophylactics are, of course, devices or medications that work against the spread of a disease or an infection. But what has happened most regrettably over the last several decades is that fertility and the child have themselves come to be seen as diseases against which one should act. Today, one can actually read in scientific medical journals, one can read of pregnancy prophylaxis as though pregnancy were a disease. Awful use of the language. Since synderesis naturally leads us to avoid evil, when an evil does appear, we instinctively act against it to eliminate it. And here we see the inextricable link between contraception and abortion. If we consistently act against the procreative good inherent in the marital act as though it were an evil, when it does appear, despite our best efforts, we take action to eliminate it. That action, of course, has come to be abortion. It's a natural sequel to induced sterility. In the 5th century, St. Augustine saw this and wrote of it. In the 5th century, the licentious cruelty of the marital couple, or their cruel licentiousness, sometimes goes to such lengths as to procure sterilizing poisons. And if these are unavailing, in some way to stifle within the womb and eject the fetus that has been conceived. They want their offspring to die before it comes to life, or if it is already living in the womb, to perish before it is born, end quote. The early church could see and understand the link that exists between contraception and abortion. So it should not surprise us when we see it in our own day. In a sense, it was natural for Planned Parenthood to go from being an advocate of contraception to being the largest provider of abortion in the world. Indeed, there has never been a society which embraced the general practice of contraception that did not go on to embrace and advocate for abortion. I have a pamphlet at home in my files issued by Planned Parenthood in 1968, the same year the encyclical Humanae Vitae was issued. This is a Planned Parenthood pamphlet, and it reads, "Plan your children for health and happiness." The pamphlet at one place posed the question, is birth control abortion? And the answer from Planned Parenthood was definitely not. Abortion kills the life of a child after it has begun. It is dangerous to your life and health. It may make you sterile so that when you want a child, you cannot have it. Birth control merely postpones the beginning of life. Today, Planned Parenthood is the largest provider of abortion in the world. There is a veritable material link as well as a philosophical one between contraception and abortion. There is the fact that many of the methods of birth regulation, which various official governmental agencies have labeled as contraceptives, are in fact abortifacients. And as a couple tries to assess techniques that might make for a quote-unquote wise decision to contracept, they may be well unaware of the medical effects of what they are choosing. In the Anglican Church, we can see, as the Church of England and its daughter churches throughout the world, the Anglican Church can show us the progression from embracing contraception to accepting abortion. In 1920, all of the Anglican bishops of the world gathered at Lambeth Palace in London. In 1920, those Anglican bishops condemned contraception in the strongest terms. Quote, "We utter an emphatic warning against the use of unnatural means for the avoidance of conception, together with the grave dangers, physical, moral, and religious, thereby incurred," end quote. However, 10 years later, the bishops of the Anglican Communion gave a very, very cautious proposal that married couples might, if abstinence proved impossible, and the Anglican bishop said if there was a need to avoid a child, the most Christian thing to do was to abstain. But if that proved impossible, they might, for a limited period of time, make use of contraception. But also in 1930, at that same conference, the bishops condemned abortion. The Anglican bishops, quote, "further records its abhorrence of the sinful practice of abortion." That was 1930. But by 1967, the Anglican Church in the United States, the Episcopal Church, supported legal abortion even before it was legalized in 1973. And just this past summer, the General Convention of the Episcopal Church, the Anglican Church in the United States, passed a resolution which stated, addressing the erosion of reproductive rights, all Episcopalians should be able to access abortion services and birth control with no restriction on movement, autonomy, type, or timing. Within 100 years, what had been condemned as sinful practice by the Anglican Church is now being demanded as a human right with no restrictions. In less than 100 years, Anglicans went from a reticent approval of contraception to a full-throated demand for universal access to abortion. Both of these practices are fruits of the same tree, as St. John Paul II so clearly saw. And now the Catholic Church is virtually the sole cultural institution holding firm on the moral convictions that literally spanned millennia. I'm not suggesting that there is a slippery slope from contraception to abortion. I am maintaining that when one can morally justify the commission of an intrinsically evil act, which is what the Church has always defined contraception to be, we are already at the bottom of the slippery slope, and virtually any act can be justified. To accept the morality of contraception is virtually to accept a false understanding of the human person, which leads to the support of other aberrant behaviors which undermine human flourishing. St. John Paul II was emphatic on this when he taught in Familiaris Consortio that there is a profound difference in the understanding of the nature of the human person between those who support contraception and those who accept Catholic teaching. The Pope wrote, "It is a difference in the understanding of the human person, is a difference which is much wider and deeper than is usually thought, one which involves in the final analysis two irreconcilable concepts of the human person and human sexuality." I conclude. St. Paul VI and his encyclical courageously stood athwart recent human history to argue forcefully for our very humanity and to call for an acknowledgement of the great good of human life, which defines what marriage itself is. Humanae Vitae, human life, defends the beauty and dignity of life, as indicated in the very name of that encyclical. It warns against violating in anticipation the good of the human life inherent in the marital act and the actual destruction of the good of human life in abortion. The encyclical defends our humanity as reasonable moral agents, which we manifest by never acting against a good as though it were an evil. The encyclical defends our humanity as reasonable moral agents by speaking to our ability to exercise self-control for the sake of human goods. The Pope wrote, "Self-discipline of this kind is a shining witness to the chastity of husband and wife, and far beyond being a hindrance to their love of one another, transforms it by giving it a more truly human character." One challenge to Humanae Vitae now and in the future is certainly the trivialization of the immorality of contraception, as though it could be a wise decision, whereas it is the very gateway to an anti-life mentality and the horrors of abortion. Humanae Vitae was a courageous encyclical issued in defense of the ineffable beauty and dignity of human life, in defense of the beauty and dignity of marriage, and frankly, in defense of our own humanity. Thank you.